Right now, in a field in northern China, there is a concrete tube stretching across empty farmland. From a distance, it looks like an oil pipeline. It is not. Inside that tube, engineers have already pushed a full-size passenger vehicle faster than any train on Earth, with nothing touching the ground and almost no air left to push against. The train has been the same basic machine for 200 years, a steel wheel, a steel rail, a heavy body dragging itself forward through the atmosphere, fighting the air the entire way. We made it faster, we made it prettier, we gave it a bullet nose and a Wi-Fi signal. But underneath, it is the same idea a British engineer sketched out in 1825, and it is running into a wall. Not a wall made of concrete, a wall made of air. Every single high-speed train on the planet, from the Japanese Shinkansen to the French TGV to the Acela running up the East Coast, is stuck behind that wall. They are not slow because the engines are weak. They are slow because, past a certain speed, the atmosphere itself becomes the enemy, and no amount of horsepower can beat it. The team in China did not try to punch through that wall. They did something much stranger. They removed the air. If you are enjoying videos like this, please hit the like button, because these take a lot of work to put together, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. What they built is not a faster train. It is not a train at all. At least not in any way we would recognize. It is a vehicle that floats inside a tube where most of the atmosphere has been sucked out, moving at speeds we normally associate with commercial aircraft. And the numbers coming out of the test site have made engineers in Germany, Japan, and the United States sit up very straight in their chairs. But to understand why this thing is such a big deal, you first need to understand exactly what is wrong with the machine it is trying to replace. And the problem is not what most people think it is. Think about every train you have ever been on. A subway car, a freight train blocking an intersection, a commuter line into the city, a high-speed rail line if you have been lucky enough to ride one overseas. They all run on the exact same principle, and it has barely changed since the 1820s. A steel wheel sits on a steel rail. The wheel turns. Friction between the wheel and the rail grabs the track and pushes the whole train forward. That is it. That is the entire idea. It is one of the most important inventions in human history. It built the American West. It moved the coal that powered the factories. It carried the mail, the grain, and the soldiers. Almost everything in modern life traveled by rail before it ever reached you. And it has two problems that engineers have been quietly fighting for a century. The first problem is the wheel itself. That steel wheel is only touching the steel rail across a patch of metal roughly the size of a coin. Everything the train does, accelerating, braking, staying on the track, happens through those tiny contact patches. That is remarkable engineering. It is also a hard physical limit. Push too much power through that little patch and the wheel just spins. Brake too hard and it slides. Run the train too fast and the wheel starts to shake because no wheel is ever perfectly round, and at 300 kilometers an hour, a flaw you could not see with your eye becomes a violent vibration. Those wheels wear down, the rails wear down, the suspension wears down. Every high-speed rail network on Earth spends enormous amounts of money grinding rails smooth and replacing wheels because metal grinding against metal at speed destroys itself. It is a machine that is slowly eating itself alive every second it operates. But the second problem is much, much bigger, and it is invisible. Air. Stick your hand out of a car window at 30 miles an hour. You feel a gentle push. Do it at 60, and your arm gets knocked backward. You doubled the speed, but the force did not double. It roughly quadrupled. That is because air resistance climbs with the square of your speed. Go twice as fast, and the atmosphere pushes back 4 times harder. Go 3 times as fast, and it pushes back 9 times harder. Now scale that up to a 400-ton train at around 350 kilometers per hour. The overwhelming majority of the energy a high-speed train burns is not being used to move the train. It is being used to shove air out of the way. The engine is not really moving people anymore. It is running an enormously expensive fan. Engineers have estimated that at those speeds, well over 3/4 of the total energy consumption goes into fighting the atmosphere alone. That is why trains stopped getting faster. Look at the timeline. The Japanese Shinkansen opened in 1964 at about 210 kilometers an hour. 60 years later, commercial high-speed rail tops out around 350. In 6 decades of the most advanced materials science in human history, we roughly added 140 kilometers an hour. Meanwhile, in that same window, we went from room-sized computers to a supercomputer in your pocket. Rail did not stall because engineers got lazy. It stalled because the air got expensive. Every extra kilometer per hour cost exponentially more energy than the last one, and at some point, the electricity bill and the noise and the track wear stopped making any sense at all. So the world hit a ceiling, and for decades, that seemed to be that. Trains would be trains, planes would be planes. If you wanted to go faster than 350, you got on an aircraft, dealt with the airport, the security line, the boarding, the taxiing, and the 2 hours of dead time that turned a 90-minute flight into a 5-hour day. The engineers in China looked at that ceiling and asked a question that sounds almost childish. What if you just took the air away? And the moment you take the air away, you run straight into a second problem you were not expecting. Because in a tube with no air, a steel wheel is completely useless. Here is the strange part of this story. Nothing about this idea is new. The concept is so old that it predates the airplane. In 1904, a young American physicist named Robert Goddard, the same man who would later build the first liquid-fueled rocket, wrote about a vehicle traveling inside a tube with the air pumped out, held up by magnetic force, moving from Boston to New York in a matter of minutes. He was a college student at the time. People thought it was a fantasy story. A few years later, in 1912, a French-born inventor named Émile Bachelet demonstrated a small model vehicle floating above a set of electromagnetic coils in front of an audience in New York. It hovered, it moved, it genuinely worked. Newspapers covered it, investors got excited. And then it went absolutely nowhere because the electricity required to levitate anything heavier than a toy was completely unaffordable in 1912. In 1934, a German engineer named Hermann Kemper filed a patent for a magnetically levitated vehicle. It is one of the foundational documents of the entire field. And again, the world moved on. So the pieces were all sitting on the table over 100 years ago. A tube with no air, a vehicle held up by magnets. Everybody knew it. Nobody could build it. To understand why magnetic levitation works at all, forget the physics for a second and think about two ordinary refrigerator magnets. Turn them the right way and they snap together. Flip one over and they push each other apart. Push hard enough and one of them will hover for a fraction of a second before it slides off sideways and falls. That sideways slide is the whole problem. Magnetic repulsion is easy. Stable magnetic repulsion, something that floats and stays floating without sliding off, is extraordinarily hard. There is even a physics theorem from the 1800s, Earnshaw's theorem, that says you fundamentally cannot do it with simple fixed magnets alone. So engineers found two ways around it. The first way is to cheat with electricity. You put sensors under the vehicle, measure the gap thousands of times per second, and constantly adjust the strength of electromagnets to hold it exactly the right distance off the track. It is not really floating. It is falling and catching itself thousands of times a second, forever. That is how the Shanghai Maglev works, the German-designed line that opened in 2004 and still runs at 430 kilometers an hour today. It works beautifully. It also requires constant power and constant computation just to sit still. The second way is far more elegant, and it uses one of the genuinely bizarre facts about our universe. When you cool certain materials down far enough, they become superconductors. Electricity flows through them with zero resistance. But something else happens too, discovered by Walther Meissner and Robert Uxenfeld in 1933. A superconductor actively pushes magnetic fields out of itself. Bring a magnet close, and the superconductor generates exactly the opposing field required to keep it away. Not approximately, exactly. The result is a vehicle that locks itself into position above the track. It does not need sensors. It does not need a computer catching it. If you push it down, it pushes back harder. If it drifts sideways, the field pulls it back into the groove. It is as if the vehicle is sitting in an invisible valley that it physically cannot climb out of. Researchers at Southwest Jiaotong University in Chengdu have been working on exactly this for years, and they built a full-scale superconducting maglev prototype that reached speeds over 600 kilometers an hour. So by the 2020s, the world had solved half the equation. We could make a vehicle float. Japan proved it. Germany proved it, China proved it, but the levitating vehicles still had the same fatal flaw as every train before them. They were still running through open air, and air, as we already established, punishes you exponentially. A maglev at 600 kilometers an hour is burning almost all its energy, shoving the atmosphere aside and screaming loudly enough while doing it that you cannot run the line near a neighborhood. Floating solved the wheel. It did nothing about the wall, which brings us to a dusty stretch of land outside a city in Shanxi province, and a team of aerospace engineers who decided to attack both problems in the same machine. The organization behind this is not a railway company. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. The work is being led by the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, CAC, which is a state-owned aerospace and defense conglomerate. These are people whose day job is rockets, missiles, and orbital hardware. They did not approach this as a train problem. They approached it as a flight problem that happens to take place at ground level. Their project is called T-Flight, and outside Datong, in Shanxi province, they built a test line that looks like nothing else on the planet, a sealed, low-vacuum tube with a magnetically levitated vehicle inside it, and enormous pumps attached to the outside whose only job is to remove most of the atmosphere from the entire structure. Here is the core insight, and it is beautifully simple. You cannot beat air resistance. It is not a technology problem. It is a law of physics, and it gets worse the harder you fight it. So do not fight it, delete it. If you pump the air out of the tube until only a small fraction of normal atmospheric pressure remains, the drag on the vehicle collapses. Suddenly, going faster is almost free. The same amount of power that would push a vehicle to 600 kilometers an hour in open air will push it to 1,000 or beyond inside the tube, because there is almost nothing left to push out of the way. And the moment you do that, all the other problems solve themselves as a side effect. There is no sonic boom, because there is barely any air to carry a shockwave. There is almost no noise outside the tube. There is no weather, no snow on the track, no leaves, no wind, no ice, no heat warping the rails, because the vehicle never touches rails and never sees the sky. There are no crossings, no animals, no debris, no trespassers. The route is a sealed pipe. Every single thing that has ever delayed a train is on the outside of that tube. The engineering, of course, is brutal, and this is where Cassic's aerospace background stops being trivia and starts being the actual reason this works. Building a vacuum vessel dozens of kilometers long that does not leak is a materials problem. Managing the thermal expansion of a steel tube that grows and shrinks with the seasons is a structural problem. Keeping a superconducting system cold while it moves at aircraft speed is a cryogenics problem. Building a linear motor that can accelerate a loaded vehicle smoothly enough that passengers do not get hurt is a propulsion problem. Those are all rocket problems. That is what these people do. In late 2023, Cassic announced the results of their full-scale system test at the Datong facility. The vehicle hit 623 kilometers per hour on a test track only about 2 kilometers long. Sit with that number for a second, because the number itself is not the impressive part. 2 kilometers is nothing. That is a runway. The vehicle spent almost the entire run accelerating and then immediately braking. It never got anywhere near its actual limit. What the test proved was not top speed. It proved the hard part. That levitation, propulsion, guidance, vacuum sealing, and braking all work together at speed in a full-size vehicle without anything going wrong. The stated roadmap goes to 1,000 kilometers per hour in the next phase, and the long-term ambition runs beyond that toward 2,000, territory that is not just faster than a plane, but faster than the speed of sound at sea level, on the ground, in a tube. Put those numbers on a map, and the world starts looking different. Beijing to Shanghai is about 1,300 kilometers. Today, the fastest high-speed rail does it in roughly 4.5 hours. At 1,000 kilometers an hour, that becomes about 90 minutes. Draw that same line in America, and you are talking Los Angeles to Denver in an hour and a half, New York to Chicago before your coffee gets cold. Not the flight time, the whole trip. No airport. No security theater, no taxiing, no circling the runway waiting for a gate. And that is the point at which the Cassic engineers seem to have realized that what they had built was not really a transportation project at all. It was something considerably stranger and considerably more useful to an aerospace company. Here is the part that most coverage of this technology completely misses. A machine that can accelerate a heavy object to thousands of kilometers per hour inside a vacuum along a precisely controlled path is not just a passenger vehicle, that is also, functionally, a launch system. Getting anything into orbit is punishingly expensive, and a huge fraction of that expense is burned in the first few seconds. A rocket sitting on a launch pad is at zero velocity in the thickest, most punishing part of the atmosphere. It has to carry the fuel to lift itself, plus the fuel to lift that fuel. The lower stage of a rocket is essentially a very expensive machine for getting the actually useful part of the rocket up to speed. Now imagine the vehicle does not start at zero. Imagine it exits a vacuum tube already traveling at a significant fraction of the speed you need, pointed up a mountainside, at an altitude where the air is already thinner. You have just deleted an enormous amount of the fuel, the mass, and the cost. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is essentially why an aerospace and missile corporation is the entity building a ground transportation system in the first place. The tube is a proving ground for high-speed electromagnetic launch, and passengers are the commercially useful version of the same hardware. But even setting orbit aside, the near-term applications are enormous. Freight is the obvious one. Right now, if you need something delivered across a continent within hours, it goes on a plane, and air freight is brutally expensive and carbon-intensive. If you can send a sealed cargo pod through a tube at 1,000 kilometers an hour, powered entirely by electricity, you have created something that has never existed. Same-day continental delivery at close to rail prices. Pharmaceuticals, blood and transplant organs, semiconductors, fresh food, anything where the value of the cargo is measured in hours. Then there is the thing almost nobody talks about: what it does to where people live. A city is not really defined by distance. It is defined by commute time. The reason housing costs what it does in the Bay Area or around New York is that only a certain amount of land sits within an acceptable commute of the jobs. Everything inside that ring gets bid up. Everything outside it empties out. Now change the commute time and watch what happens. If a town 300 miles away is suddenly 20 minutes from downtown, that town is no longer a small town, it is a suburb. Every dying Rust Belt city with cheap housing and empty infrastructure sitting on a tube corridor becomes viable overnight. Transportation technology has done this before, every single time. The streetcar created the first suburbs. The interstate highway system created the modern American exurb and gutted the city center. The passenger jet made entire industries possible that could not have existed before it. A machine that collapses continental distance to under 2 hours does not just move people faster, it redraws the map of where it makes sense to build a life, which is exactly why we should be extremely careful about the gap between a 2-kilometer test tube in Shanxi and any of this actually existing, because that gap is enormous, and it is worth being honest about it. It is important to be clear about where this technology genuinely stands right now. What exists at Datong is a test facility. It is a short line, a prototype vehicle, and a set of successful engineering demonstrations. There is no commercial route carrying paying passengers. There is no confirmed date for one. Every proposed timeline you will read about should be treated as an ambition, not a schedule, and the obstacles remaining are serious. The first is cost, and it is the one that has killed every project like this so far. You are not laying track. You are building a sealed, precision-engineered steel vacuum vessel across hundreds of kilometers of real terrain with rivers and mountains and cities and property owners in the way. Every kilometer of it has to hold vacuum. Every kilometer of it has to be maintained. Conventional high-speed rail is already one of the most expensive things a country can build, and this is meaningfully harder than that. The second is the vacuum itself, which is a maintenance problem that never ends. A sealed tube is only sealed until something happens. Thermal cycling stresses joints, ground settles, earthquakes happen. And you have to open the tube at stations, which means airlocks, which means complexity at exactly the point where passengers are standing. The third is safety, and this is the one engineers worry about most. In a conventional train, an emergency means you stop and open the doors. In a vacuum tube, a stopped vehicle is a sealed capsule in an environment where nobody can breathe, potentially many kilometers from the nearest access point. Every serious version of this system needs a credible answer for evacuation, for pressure loss, and for what happens when the vehicle simply stops in the middle. Those answers exist on paper. None of them have been proven at scale with real people inside. The fourth is throughput. A train can carry 1,000 people at once. These vehicles are small. To move the same number of passengers, you need vehicles departing constantly, at high speed, in the same tube, which means the control system needs to be flawless, permanently, with no margin for a bad day. And there is a fifth issue that has nothing to do with engineering. Even if the machine works perfectly, someone has to assemble the land rights, the political will, the capital, and the regulatory framework to build hundreds of kilometers of it. That is often the part that fails. The United States has spent decades and billions attempting far simpler rail projects that still do not carry passengers. So no, the train is not obsolete this year or next year, but every transformative technology in history looked exactly like this at this stage. The first commercial jet airliners were widely considered too expensive and too risky. The first solar panels cost so much per watt that they were only used on satellites. The first computers filled rooms and could not do what a calculator does now. The pattern is always the same: a working prototype that is too expensive, followed by 20 years of unglamorous engineering that makes it cheap. What Kasich proved at Datong is that the physics is not the obstacle anymore. The vehicle floats, the tube holds, the vacuum works, the propulsion works at full scale with a real vehicle. Everything remaining is an economics and engineering problem, and economics and engineering problems tend to eventually lose. It is a genuinely strange thing to think about. The train sitting in a rail yard right now, the one you can hear from your house at night, works on essentially the same idea a man sketched out in England in 1825. Steel wheel, steel rail, brute force against the air. We spent 200 years making that idea as good as it can possibly get, and we finished. There is nothing meaningful left to squeeze out of it. And meanwhile, in a field in Shanxi province, there is a pipe lying across the ground with almost nothing inside it, and something floating in that nothing, going faster than anything on rails has ever gone. Technology like this almost never arrives the way we imagine. It does not show up as a grand unveiling. It shows up as a short test track in an unglamorous place. In engineering papers nobody outside the field reads, years and years before it touches an ordinary life. And then one day, it is simply how people get around, and nobody remembers that it was ever remarkable. Maybe the loudest thing about the future is that it will be quiet. No engine noise, no sonic boom, no rails to grind, just a sealed tube and something inside it moving at the speed of an airliner, 3 feet off the ground, on the way to a city that used to be a day away. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. There are more videos on the screen right now if you want to keep watching. So here is my question for you. If a city 300 miles away suddenly became a 20-minute trip, where would you actually choose to live? Let me know in the comments.